Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. In this guide I will show you how naval armor and piercing really works. This is probably one of the most important naval mechanics to understand, and the reason why is because of two things, and that is damage reduction and critical hits. So let's get started. Alright, so let's start with the obvious question. Why do you want to pierce the enemy armor? Like I said before in the intro, the reason are twofold, and it's because of damage reduction and critical hits. But let's start with damage reduction, as that's the most simple one to explain and to understand. Basically, your damage will be lowered by the ratio between the piercing value of the enemy ship and your armor value. So if your armor value is higher than the piercing, there will be a formula always telling what the damage output will be, or the reduction of the damage. I'll post the formula here somewhere. But let's make a let's take an example. So in this case, I have this battleship here that has an armor value of 40 and a piercing value of 36. So let's play with the idea that this ship would fight itself. So we have two identical ships with more armor than piercing, both of them, with a gap of 4. So basically, based on the formula that you just saw, both ships would have a damage reduction of 9% against each other. Which doesn't sound like that much, but it makes a big difference. But the thing is, the bigger the gap, the more the damage reduction. So the point is that you always want to have as much armor as possible compared to the enemy piercing. So you never want to stop prioritizing armor. There's no clear threshold for that purpose alone. But before moving on, I just want to take a short moment and say that most of you watching this are not yet subscribers. So please take your time, hit the subscribe button, like, comment, and you will receive a new guide from us every Monday. And for all of you that are watching that are done with all of our guides and watched all of them, and you want more, then you can become a Patreon, and then you will have an archive of already 12 guides that you will get off the bat, and then a new extra Patreon guide every second week. All right, let's continue. All right, so what about critical hits? Well, first of all, if you land a critical hit on an enemy ship, you do a lot of bonus damage. Theoretically, you can do up to 900% extra damage. However, this is how the damage from critical hits is calculated. Probably deserves a guide of its own, so I will look into that in a few weeks or so. But the point is that you really want to land critical hits when you're in a naval battle. So let me show you how it's connected to armor and piercing. So right now we have a naval engagement here between the UK and Germany in a battle. And what you can see here from the tooltip is if you hover on the heavy guns, the light guns as well, but if you hover on the heavy guns to continue on the example we had before, you can see how the piercing, the increased piercing versus the armor increases your chances for a critical hit. And what's really important to notice here as well is that once you past the point of being able to pierce the enemy armor, it continues above that point. So even though you already pierced the enemy armor, you don't want to stop there. You want to continue to have higher piercing value, because you will always be able to have a higher chance for landing a critical hit. So just like you, in the other example I gave you before, want higher armor to have a bigger gap for a higher damage reduction, you always also want to have higher piercing, not only for removing the enemy damage reduction, but also for your chances to increase critical hit chances, which will lead to more damage. Alright, so what can you do to improve your armor and your piercing value? Well, the first and most obvious one, of course, is the armament and the designs on your ships. So here you have the different armors that you can put on your ship, and then you have, for example, Battleship Armor 2, which will give you 36 in armor, Battleship Armor 3 will give you 40 armor, and so on. And on the other side you have the armaments here that will increase your piercing value, and so on. So those are the obvious ones. But there are also some texts that can improve your piercing, and those are the small ones here in between. So as you can see here, if I hover this one, you have battleship, heavy attack, heavy piercing 5%, heavy piercing 5%, and the same for light piercing, and so on. So those small texts are very important because that gives you a buff right away. And also you have the MIOs. So for example, if you refit all your ships, which I usually do once this is in a high level, I put all my imported ships into harbor, refit them, and then back out, because that's a very cheap way to do it. So for example, in the right one here, I always go down here for extra 10% piercing for battleships, and then an extra 5% piercing down here. And then of course for armor, I can push it up here and down here as well. So those are two quite obvious ones for armor and piercing. One thing that many do miss is that the defense stat on your admiral, for in this case Andrew Cunningham, has 20% naval defense. And if I take a ship here that's engaged in battle, we have, for example, Queen Elizabeth class. So if we look at that ship, there we go. It's supposed to have 30 in armor. However, if I click on it here, it has 36. And that's because of the defense stat gives a flat 20% straight to the armor. However, the damage stat doesn't improve the piercing. It only improves the heavy and the light attack. So picking the right general for your main battle fleet, and especially looking at the defense stat, can be incredibly powerful, because many times it's easy to just look at the attack value and then oversee the defense stat, which is probably the most important one. Yes, and then there's another thing, and that's the marksman trait. So if you're down here on Ironside, and if you go that way, and you look at marksman, then you have an additional 10% chance to score a critical hit, which might not sound as much, but it is a lot. The other way around, if you're Crisis Magician, you see both those two steps here have, the first one has 25% chance minus to receive a critical hit, and then the effects of sustained critical hits is minus 50%. And that might sound like a question mark, but I will probably explain that in another guide regarding critical hits, but it's very powerful as well. So to round this one off, what have you learned? What are the conclusions? Well, basically, you never want to stop having higher armor. And I've talked a lot about battleships now, or capital ships, but the same thing goes for screens, so light cruisers, destroyers. Or destroyers can't have armor, but light cruisers. So always improve your armor, because it will always reduce the damage you take, and also the enemy chances to score a critical hit on you. The other way around, you always want to have more piercing. So sometimes when you do your designs, you can have more like heavy attack or light attack at the cost of piercing. But I wouldn't do that. I would always prioritize piercing over the damage output, because if you land a critical hit, that would do much, much more than the actual damage output that your armament have. That was everything. I hope you liked it. So thank you so much.